Right, good morning ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this September's meeting of the Executive. I'm Councillor Martin Hill, Chairman of this committee and Leader of the Council. So welcome to you all on this soon to be very hot Tuesday, last of the summer wine, as they say. Welcome to seem to get a bit of feedback there, so hopefully that's hearing myself 2 seconds ago. So, okay, without further ado then, welcome to everybody. We'll start with agenda item 1 then. Apologies for absence, please.
Thank you, Leader. We have apologies from Councillor Mrs Bradwell and Councillor Mrs Bowkett.
Thank you very much for that. Okay, move on to item 2 then. There are any declarations of interest which any councillor or officer wish to make? I'm not seeing any, so I'll take that as read. There are none. I'll then move on to item 3 then, which is announcements by myself or executive councillors or members of or directors as well. So I think the only announcement I have to make is on devolution, that the government did indicate 2 months ago, a few months ago now, that they were looking at rolling out devolution to the non-metropolitan areas, and Boris Johnson made a speech in July where he indicated that that was on the cards and they were looking at rural areas, county areas as he put it towards the end of his speech, and it would be done through upper tier or strategic authorities or county councils, I suppose, in our sense. That was followed up by a letter from Robert Jenrick, the Secretary of State, putting a little more flesh on the bones, clarifying it was county areas and they were looking at deals similar or at least as given the same or at least the same powers that metro mayors currently have. So there's been some conversations recently, just trying to find out what more is involved. In terms of governance, there is some movement from the government in terms of what sort of governance will be required from government to actually devolve powers down to local areas. That's still not very clear, but it does seem it's a little bit less rigid than it was previously. Also, the requirement to go to unitary status is no longer a firm requirement, although that is still on the table if areas wish to do that. And they're also looking at a single count of appointability in terms of individuals. Whether that individual will have to be directly elected, I think, is very much up in the air and subject to negotiations. So following that, the 10 leaders of Greater Lincolnshire have met and we have sent a joint letter to the government indicating, yes, that we are interested, still interested in pursuing devolution for Greater Lincolnshire. And we are currently working up proposals of an offer we could put to government, and that process is still in train. The white paper on devolution and levelling up is now due late October, I'm informed, and that will probably set out more clearly the direction of travel and indeed the requirements the government wants to do. So I think it's very important that we pursue this agenda. There is no money now. I mean, in the past there was money put on the table by government for those areas, effectively which wanted to have a directly elected mayor or combined authority, but I think that's gone now, and I think we'll just have to wait and see what's on the table. But certainly in matters like skills, for example, I think there's a big, a screaming desire that actually we are able to have get hold of the skills agenda locally so that we can encourage the providers of skills and the training to actually match up what businesses require. I think we all accept that there is going to be a massive change in terms of what skills are needed, and as things change in terms of employment, there will also be a big need for people to be reskilled as they move into different sectors of employment. So that's my announcement. Are there any further announcements, please? I'm just looking around the room. Not seeing any. Okay, thank you for that. So then, excuse me, we move on to item 4, which is the minutes of this meeting held on the 6th of July. Is it your wish that I sign these as a true and accurate record, please? Good, that's agreed. Thank you very much. Okay then, so we'll then move on to item 5, which is the first substantive item, which is an Ombudsman report into some issues we had in adult social care. So I'll start with Glenn Garrett, and then we'll consider the Ombudsman's report and our response to it.
Thank you, Leader. And this particular item covers both the previous and the current portfolio holder's tenure. I know that Councillor Bradwell and Councillor Bokit are both very much cited on this particular item, which started some years ago when the Ombudsman was investigating another matter within adult social care charging and identified a policy of the council which effectively set a flat rate for people entering short-term residential care. The flat rate, in the Ombudsman's opinion, was against the intentions of the Care Act as implemented in 2015. The consequence of that was a policy finding against the council, which in turn has become a public notice. The council, at the time, Councillor Bradwell's decision last year was to revise the charging policy of the authority with support from members and to create a conventional charging arrangement whereby individuals were assessed as to their ability to pay, so that we moved away from a flat rate, which the paper identifies in terms of how much that was, and set a normal approach of charging people based upon an assessment of their ability to pay. That process in terms of recompensing people going back to April 2015 has begun. We expect to be through all the people affected by the end of October this year. That's just over 1,500 people. And I will hand over now to Pam Clipson, who is the financial advisor to adult care, to fill you in on any further details.
Thank you, Glenn. Yeah, I think Glenn's covered the majority. The charging policy that came in as of April last year does ensure that everybody follows a financial assessment for whatever type of care they go into. And we have made put things in place within that policy to ensure that we can make sure that it's affordable to those individuals. As at the end of August, we have distributed to 484 of the people that are due a refund. We have to offer them the refund. A lot of them are not within our care currently, so obviously we don't hold their details. Out of those 444, 199 people to date have taken up that offer, and they have been refunded £66,584. The total exposure to the council, should the full 1,525 people accept the refund, is now £364,000, and that will change as we work through every individual that's been in receipt of care between 2015 and 1st of April 2020. We do work with the individuals concerned. It's not a blanket or an average approach, which is why it's taken us till, and will take us till the end of October to get through everybody. We have had, unfortunately, they had a number of service users that have died since 2015, and with the response given to the Ombudsman, we haven't contacted those families, predominantly because we don't know, we don't hold their details, we don't know where they are. Some of them are not even in the area, you know, all those sorts of different things. So we have got agreement not to go back and contact those people's families, and that's the difference between the number in the report and the 1,525 that we are refunding. I think that's all the details we've got. Take any questions?
Okay, thank you for that. So it went to scrutiny. Something has been circulated. I don't know anybody wishes to summarise that, but it has been circulated. No, it hasn't. There's in the papers there is the comments from scrutiny. Anybody can wants to add or comment on that? No. Okay. I mean, it's interesting reading the report. It is an opinion that it's a difference of opinion between what we felt was well, I mean, the Ombudsman's not saying what we did was illegal. He's saying it's the interpretation of the Act. And I think there is a case where we took a view, which I think was a reasonable view at the time. The Ombudsman took a reasonable view, and I think we have bowed to his wishes. But I think there is a point of principle here that we're elected to make decisions, not the Ombudsman. So although I think it's the correct decision, and I think most councils do actually do the flat rate now, don't they? I do think there's an issue that, you know, if the Ombudsman wants to set policy, perhaps he should stand for election and do it that way, as opposed to use his powers in this case to effectively bully a council into doing what he thinks it should be doing. But I don't know if that's a fair comment, Glenn, or not.
Thank you, Leader. So the Ombudsman has two roles nationally. The first is to investigate cases where there appears to be maladministration by a local government body. Those historically have tended to be the majority of cases an Ombudsman would investigate. When the new Ombudsman was appointed a few years ago, Mr. King, he wanted to rebalance his portfolio so that he would look more at policy matters where councils had interpreted a policy as set out in statute for itself. He now more regularly challenges authorities where his interpretation of statute differs from that of the council. This is case in point. It should be noted by members that nobody had complained in all the years that we had implemented a flat rate policy on charging for respite care. There were no complaints whatsoever. It was a pure matter of policy that the Ombudsman intervened. I think it's also important that members realise that there were arguably as many winners as losers on setting a flat rate. People had been, if we had gone back and charged people who had been undercharged, then there'd be a similar number of people who were having to pay the council going back 6 years now. The portfolio holder at the time, Councillor Bradwell, decided she would not pursue people who had been undercharged, and it would be the council's decision to only look to reimburse people who had apparently been overcharged. Thank you, Leader.
Thank you. I think we would support the not chasing those people who had been, in theory, undercharged. So yes, I mean, it is what it is, and I think the decision has been made that we will accede to the Ombudsman's views. But I think there is a principle here that, you know, the point of having locally elected councils across the country, all of us come up with local decisions and solutions which actually are, we believe, as elected people, that are correct for that area, because we have to balance the need and we have to balance also the sort of resources available. So it is, personally, I do have a concern about this, because in the end, is the Ombudsman going to start running all the social care? Then the Ombudsman's office can actually try the job of balancing the budgets as well, perhaps. So I can't say I'm entirely happy with the with this report, but I think on balance it's probably the right thing to do to accept this and the policy changes, and of course then compensate those people who have been overcharged according to the change of policy. So has anybody else got anything to add on this? But I think that's clearly where the recommendations is. So the recommendations are there on page, find them, excuse me for a moment. So on page, can't find the page, but basically there's 1, 2, 3 recommendations there. We consider the report, we accept the findings and recommendations, and then confirm the actions which have been taken. Are those recommendations then agreed? Agreed? Anybody against? No abstentions? Okay, thank you. That's been agreed then, thank you. Then we now move on to the Revenue Budget Monitoring Report for this current financial year. So, Andrew, thank you.
Thank you, Leader. Yeah, pleased to introduce both of the Q1 revenue and capital reports for you today. Generally, this stage of the year, we generally see this report as a direction of travel, and that is still the case in some areas of our business as usual spend. However, that's more developed in some areas than others due to the extensive reporting that we're still required around our COVID expenditure. where we are still in a very detailed monthly reporting regime. As it stands, we don't expect to receive any more further general COVID grant income. However, some specific grant streams remain and will do for some time. And I guess to reiterate some of the key messages I shared when we were last executive back in July when we were covering the outturn report, we are starting to see that the after effects of the pandemic will likely leave us with some significant cost pressures into future years over the medium term, particularly around adult care, children's social care, waste, and as well as that, likely increased costs around our capital activities due to supply chain issues that I hope many people are aware of through particularly around media reports around that type of thing. So those will naturally feed into our discussions later on in the autumn as we start to talk about budget setting for next year and future years. And naturally we're keeping an eye nationally as well on developments around the spending review and other national funding issues which are likely to start to come to a head in the autumn too. Understand that the spending review will likely be at the end of October. So that was my introduction. If it's okay with you, Leader, I'd hand over to Michelle to go into some more detail. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm just going to pick up on a few details in the report. As Andrew said, this is a Q1 early indication of any variances on our approved budgets, and the report starts at page 31 in your reports pack. In terms of the revenue budget, our Q1 position is that we're currently forecasting an underspend of 1.194 million on our service budgets, which excludes schools. The report's kind of picking up on key impacts that have mainly carried on from our year-end report for last year. The largest variance we're reporting this quarter is currently in adult care and community wellbeing, where we're seeing a continuation of resources that are supporting the COVID response being diverted to that and costs being met from the grants that have been provided to support the COVID costs. Page 33 also picks up some other key highlights, key variances that have continued from last year, and as Andrew's just mentioned, some of those being areas like looked after children and waste. Currently, those variances are still filtering through from last year as an outcome of the COVID impact. The direct costs of COVID are shown on Appendix K in page 63 of the report. It gives an overall position of our forecast spends currently on the COVID grant, the general grant, being 23 million, a grant against a grant available of 17 million. A large proportion of that relates to pressures that we're seeing coming through on our capital projects, which we'll keep under review and consider whether other spend in the current capital programme can be reprofiled or deferred to ensure we keep the costs within our funding available for the year. Appendix O, also on page 69, includes some of the specific grants that we've received this year relating to COVID, an additional 37 million coming through into the new year, with 22 of that being quite specific use grants, and a forecast of the spend also on that appendix. The planned savings for the year are detailed in Appendix L on page 64. All of the savings are currently forecast to be delivered. However, there is a risk identified relating to service user income, and that's currently being kept under review and relates to some of the items that we've currently talked about in terms of adult care service user income and some of the risks around that. We're also reporting on our development fund initiatives, which are included in Appendix M on page 66, with a planned £3.1 million of that fund to be utilised for revenue and capital initiatives during this year. So at that point, I'll hand over for any questions or comments.
Thank you for that. So also we've had the scrutiny comments. Councillor Parker. Thank you.
Thank you. The paper's been circulated to members of the executive. The scrutiny committee did look in detail at the revenue budget report. The points that we'd want to bring to the surface, yes, overall there has been an underspend of 1.194 million excluding COVID in schools, and particularly in relation to COVID, we'd be interested in seeing when the Q2 report comes whether that is in any way reduced. The raw materials issue, there's a variety of reasons why there's been a difference in spending between planned and actual, mainly concerned with seriously external interventions, raw materials, for example, supply issues, labour shortages. I think that the second major point that we'd be interested in looking at again in the future is in relation to the forecast overspend in the fire and rescue due to the covering of long-term sickness. We discussed the matter and the Chief Executive agreed to provide a briefing paper to the board on the sickness figures in relation to Lincolnshire Fire and Rescue. So that's an ongoing issue that I think may want to return to. The COVID winter support grant for families is important, and we took the view that commented on that in the meeting. I think those are the important points that I want to bring to the surface. We noted particularly, though, the extra spending of £12 million additional funding for highways with a £10 million follow-up for unclassified roads. We look forward to the next report, but perhaps showing a little bit more of the back to normal that we expected when we set the budget in the first place.
Thank you very much for that. So if we just pick up on the fire and rescue issue, I don't know, is there a specific issue in fire and rescue that's not generic to the rest of the council? Can anybody?
Sorry, Councillor Hill.
Yes.
Thank you very much. So yes, the committee looked at the sickness rates, and the sickness rates in fire and rescue is higher than most of the other departments across the council. Predominant reasons for sickness relate to musculoskeletal reasons because of sort of lifting and manual handling, and then associated stress due to the sort of some of the incidences that they've witnessed, and particularly recently we've had a couple of very significant and sad cases that the fire and rescue team have had to go out to, and so I'd agreed to do a more detailed briefing around what the sickness reasons were, which I've just summarised, but also what we're doing to address it as well in terms of improving our offer to our fire and rescue firefighters to be able to support them to try and reduce the level of sickness.
Thank you, but they're not doing anything they haven't done before. So I suppose the question is, what are the causes of this particular, what's changing, I suppose, is we need to identify, don't we?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. I think that there is an increased requirement in terms of our training to be able to support our firefighters, particularly around manual handling, as well as then there is, we are seeing a bit of a spike, maybe COVID related, maybe not COVID related, but we are also seeing a bit of a spike as a direct response of actually having a number of instances which have been quite tragic and have resulted in staff being taking time off sick as well.
Okay. Thank you. Comments? Further comments? Yes, Councillor Davis. Thank you.
Thank you, Leader. Just generally, I mean, it's very pleasing to see the savings all on target. I know it's only Q1. I kind of wonder whether or not we've been ambitious enough. So it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. I think the other thing we need to look on, building on some of the comments from Councillor Parker and the changing labour markets and supply chains, now is the time to start thinking about how our forward delivery of programmes is going to be affected, and is there anything we should be doing now to make allowances for driver shortages, access to staff, materials in terms of, you know, the forward build programme. And I think it would be useful to have something on the forward agenda looking at that. Is there anything we can be doing now?
I think that's a very valid point, because it's not only the cost of the raw materials, which are escalating very rapidly at the moment, and it's nothing unique to this council or indeed local government. I think everybody who runs any organisation is encountering the same problems, but there is going to be severe problems with labour shortages in particular. We've all heard about drivers, you know, you can't get, but there's a whole raft of changes coming along, and it's going to cause some major pressures on the council. So I suppose it's an issue, and I think it's absolutely right that we do look at what mitigating circumstances there are. I mean, there's things like home care, where we know there's also issues about recruiting people, and we seem to have gone from a position about a year ago worrying about all those people are going to lose their jobs, what are they going to be doing, to where are the people to do the jobs that we need doing. And I think there's a big issue here, and there's probably some decisions as well in terms of what we do, how we do it, and indeed are there some things we might not, even though we have to fulfil our statutory requirements, are there some things we probably have to do differently, or even, should I say, less, because if we can't recruit the people to do the job, and I know the government's saying, well, of course, we need to you know, stop relying on cheap labour, the country, and we need to mechanise. Well, these things, won't happen overnight. I think that's probably where we get to. But things like home care or personal care services, well, there's not an army of robots out there to do it. So there's an issue that we've all got in terms of how we do it. So I think there's a big issue. I think Councillor Davies is quite right to raise it. It's something, I don't know what in terms of short term, what we're looking at in short term, sort of planning to get through this, because it will have an impact both on the budget but also on our service delivery as well.
Thank you much. A really important point, and something that the corporate leadership team were discussing this morning. So certainly across our commissioned services, particularly with regard to transport, as well as then the sort of daycare, domiciliary care sector, as well as the sort of construction service, we are beginning to see some significant challenges. We're also beginning to see some challenges in terms of labour supply for our directly delivered services, in terms of children's social care, but not just limited to that, and limited to, and perhaps now expanding into some of those sectors where we haven't had a problem recruitment previously, such as business support and those sort of areas. We're also seeing as well some challenges recruiting apprenticeships, and we haven't experienced that before. So I think to put something on the forward plan so that we've got a complete and comprehensive understanding about the implications for our directly delivered as well as our commissioned services would be very helpful, to be able to begin to share with you what our plans are, but also to generate some debate about what else we can do to mitigate some of those unintended consequences. So I think it's a really important and valid point.
Thank you for that. The only other one I had on highways, which was a very small overspend, talking about the pain on the revenue element. Could somebody, where's Andy gone, explain what that means?
Thank you, Councillor Hill. As you know, in the context of how the NEC contracts are set up, the arrangements are that target costs are set in place in respect of the way that works are carried out. And then if there's either an over or an under sort of like return on those costs, then that's split on a pay and gain basis. What the pain is indicating is that obviously some of those existing mechanisms aren't quite hitting the mark in terms of what was expected. Some of that may be as a result of COVID in the short term, because again, you're aware that obviously under some of the arrangements that had to be made, they had to send out gangs in separate vehicles because of sort of distances, separation distances, etc. But the expectation is that the lessons that are learned in terms of what's given us that sort of slight overspend, that will be reflected in changes to target cost setting and refined work practices. So we would expect that to even itself out over the course of the year.
But bearing in mind the challenges we just talked about, would that impact on more pain or more gain, or what for us?
There is a potential for that. So one of the areas which there's been a number of areas where Balfour Beatties have been giving us early warnings in terms of cost increases, which then get factored into revised pricing, etc. They're also flagging to us some of the issues around wage levels for some of their staff. They have a contract with Warwickshire, very similar to the one with us. They're already going through a process there of actually having to review their salary levels for particular groups of staff. The one where I'd indicate where it might have a potential risk for us is in the context of the HGV drivers, because obviously they then double up as our gritter drivers. And whilst I don't want to sort of alarm anyone, there is potentially a risk then of not having a sufficient supply of gritter drivers during the winter, which then could have an impact on actually whether we have to find drivers from elsewhere, or dare I say even reduce the gritting programme, because if they're unable to take the gritters out, then obviously that's a serious consequence. So those conversations are taking place. Ultimately, if there's a greater cost to actually the labour, the bottom line is then we'll get less return in terms of actually physical works that can be delivered through the contract.
There is a balance between just swallowing the cost or just accepting things will take longer, and that's another conversation to be had, because because we can't just, we don't know whether things will settle down certainly in terms of all sorts of things, whether this is a one-off shock or whether there's a sort of underlying move towards a different sort of setup. And it does seem that with labour shortages, of course, that will inevitably mean there'll be increases in what people expect to be paid, because obviously they can command a higher salary by just moving. Yes, Richard. Yeah.
Just to come in on that, Leila, you're absolutely right. I think we also need to prepare ourselves for doing less as well. It's simply because the cost of doing works will go up, so you won't be able to do as much, which is disappointing, especially when you couple it with what the government has done to our budgets in terms of highway maintenance this year.
So in the past, I've also known that there's this issue of people, and it used to be in social care, that people, if there's a shortage, then people just start just moving around. Planning was a classic example. I don't know what mitigation, and usually the answer is that local government sector, you try and have a united front, so otherwise Peter's robbing Paul all the time, and it becomes an escalation. It's a well-known problem. I don't know what thoughts have been given to trying to sort of at least, you won't prevent it, but at least mitigate it. Did you want to come in, Councillor David?
Yeah, thank you, Leader. And just to add to this discussion, I think, you know, that this is not a short-term blip, and I think we need to be planning for a significant change going forward in terms of labour market. And as you rightly said, Leader, you know, we have this tendency to use Peter to rob Paul, and it goes round in a vicious circle, driving up salary and wage costs. And I know, living on the coast as I do, you know, there are significant challenges already around home care. There's not enough people to deliver the services. That's only going to get worse during the winter months, particularly with the re-emergence of COVID infections and people being pinged or told to stay at home, etc. So we are going to have some real challenges. But my fear is that the labour market that will spiral wages out of control. And certainly for us, where we're delivering services or commissioning services, there could be a significant hit on budgets going forward. So we need to have a really serious discussion about this. And I would suggest as soon as possible rather than in 3 months' time, because I think the challenges are going to become very evident by the end of October. And I think, you know, I would say that knowing some of our departments are operating at staffing levels which, you know, if 1 or 2 people leave, we could have real problems. We really perhaps need to be thinking about, should we recruit the people of the future now rather than waiting for a year or two? Because I think this challenge around labour is going to be so significant in the years ahead as wages become so competitive in other sectors. You know, the gold-plated pensions that people talk about in the public sector may not be as attractive as they have been in the past.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone else heard it this morning, but there was an interesting little bit on, I think it was the radio, that Tesco were going to ask the government if they could have more flexibility in their apprenticeship scheme to train up those apprentices as lorry drivers, or pay for driving lessons. Now, I'm not suggesting that we get in touch with government and say we want all of our apprentices, or indeed all of our officers, reskilled as HGV drivers, but it is quite an interesting point that the more that we make our job offers interesting and add on, then the chances are, then we, from a recruitment point of view, if we factor those or are allowed to factor those extras in, then we're more likely to get a good cohort of people wanting to apply for positions. So I think it is a principle around that. What more can we do to make a position really, really interesting?
Thank you, Leader. Absolutely, the workforce issues in social care, both nationally and locally, are a major challenge for us. I do think we're going to have a pretty rough winter, not just in social care, but also in the NHS. It's going to be difficult, I think, because we're still during COVID, of course. Winter pressures is already starting to play out, and there are some limitations in the system because of the capacity issues in staffing. We know that this is true for both clinical grades as it is vocational work. There's already a lot of joint work across the providers in social care. They are sharing staff across the county. If one provider is really struggling to deliver care to existing people, another provider who's got a little bit more capacity is willing now to share staff across the county. Unfortunately, everyone's now in the same boat. We've also got examples where the hospitality trade, which has picked up in recent times, is able to offer golden handshakes to people in critical roles. For example, in a residential home, cooks particularly are finding better employment opportunities elsewhere. So as other sectors pick up, they are beginning to become something of a drain in terms of existing staffing within social care. I think the difficulties that our NHS colleagues are facing is well known. Some 4,000 nurses in Lincolnshire needed, and they won't be probably recruitable in advance of the winter this year. So, as councillors have rightly said, this deserves a level of priority and profile and as many hands to the pump as possible. I think it's also likely that we can expect the PM later today to say something about those workforce challenges in social care. I do have a sense of what might be forthcoming later in the day in terms of both social care reform and future funding, which I hope may go some way towards helping to start to alleviate the difficulties we're facing. Thank you, Leader.
Any further comments, contributions? Okay, the recommendations are that we note the current position, and obviously we have decided that we need to focus on, and there's no corrective action for financially at the moment, but early days yet, but we obviously do need to do some early work in trying to think through the consequences of these new challenges. Okay, is that agreed? Thank you. So then we move on to the final paper, I believe, which is the capital report. You straight on to Michelle, thank you.
Thank you very much. So just a continuation of a similar story in Q1 on the capital budget. So we're currently forecasting an underspend position on our capital programme of 26.913 million. That's split down between our block budgets of 13.4 million and 13.5 on projects. The appendices on page 78 and 79 break these variances down further into the individual project and block lines. What's important to emphasise is these variances, whilst they're showing an underspend, it's not a suggestion that these schemes and projects do not require the budget that's been assigned to them to complete. This is a reflection of slippage in timing, and we're not suggesting at all that these projects are underspending in terms of the cost of those schemes. Mainly these underspends are coming on some of our larger projects, some of the major road schemes, and they're a timing issue rather than a reflection of what those schemes are costing. So I'll just hand over for any questions or comments.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, obviously there is a large underspend, but it doesn't mean to say it's not going to happen. Most of it will happen, well, all of it will happen, but just a bit slower than anticipated, I think is a fair comment. So has anybody got any questions, comments on that? Again, pretty straightforward. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. I know your ongoing attempts to confuse me succeed as ever. I just wondered if you could provide some clarity. I like at the back, you know, we do the page breakdown. I think that's really useful. But I'm just a little uncertain as to what the colour scheme means. And also it talks about parentheses being an underspend but then has a negative figure. Could you just explain what you mean? What does that mean? So, for just picking one out, more at random, page 86, block scheme children's services. You've put a forecast net over brackets underspend as minus just over £1 million. Now, is that a negative overspend, an underspend, or is it a positive underspend, which is an overspend?
It's a forecast underspend. It's shown as red because it will be within an underspend doesn't necessarily mean a good position. So if it's beyond a 1% underspend, then it's been shown as red on here because it should ask the question.
That's your kind of boundary, is it?
Yes.
1%?
Yeah.
Okay. So a negative overspend is an underspend?
A negative is an underspend.
Yeah, I just want to, because you put in parentheses underspend, I'm surprised you don't just put it in parentheses.
So the overspend is shown as a positive figure.
Yes.
The underspend is shown as a negative figure.
Okay. For example, on that one as well, it says in the performance of scheme box that the expenditure on the scheme is expected to be 0.972 million. And I'm guessing that's because that's outside the budget year, because that figure isn't referenced anywhere else on the page.
No, that's a very good question. One that I would need to go away and check just to make sure that the comments are indeed in line with the figures. But usually some of this is confusing because there's a gross and net position to look at, and some of the quotes will be net and some of the figures are
I get that.
Yeah.
And if the scheme lives outside one financial year, you wouldn't necessarily fence, but it would be useful to clarify that.
I will. I can.
And there are a couple of. I like the new word that seems to have crept in over the last few reports, vehement, which is lovely. Thank you for that. I think my other comment would be, I think some of the performance of scheme kind of narrative could do with working on, with the greatest respect. For example, if we go to bear with me, towards the end, for example, on page 105, forecast to be updated in August. Does that mean August next year, or should that have been updated?
I think probably this is a reflection of the cycle that these reports go through. So the team and the services indeed will have provided these comments probably back at the end of July. This is the first quarter report to the end of June.
Right.
So the forecast will have been at the position at the end of June. Obviously then goes through a cycle of CLT, scrutiny, and before it comes to here, so they will have been.
That's just a natural lag in the system.
Yeah. It's comments that will have been written, not realising that a report will then be coming through to committee in a few weeks' time.
Yeah, because I'm reading of that, and the general public might think, but hold on, it's September.
Fair comment. I think we've been trying to improve the narrative around our capital programme, and you'll understand the importance of telling the story of where our schemes are going, particularly the longer term schemes. It's definitely a work in progress. We're hoping that this is an improvement in terms of some of the visibility, and it's definitely generating some questions, which is what it's there to do. But I accept that there's still quite a bit of work to do.
I think you notice it because some of the breakdowns are really good. The other one that did confuse me slightly is on a couple of them. It says no forecast in future years entered in BW, but early indications are on target. Now I'm guessing BW is Business World, but that's it. That feels, and bearing in mind it's copied and pasted in 3 and 4 of these. I'm not sure that's telling me much, about what that scheme may or may not be doing.
Yeah, that's fair comment. I think the lesson we need to learn is that some of these reports are obviously starting at department management teams with the exec directors, and then need to just recognise that they are coming through into public reports. That's absolutely fair comment. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I think it's quite difficult, and everything's there. I mean, for example, I'm looking at page 94, which is Highways Asset Protect, for example, and by the time you've added them up, but they don't then add up, you see, because if you look at the figures there, you've got gross expenditure of 46 and you've got gross income of 42, but then it doesn't really tally with some of the other figures. It is it's all there, but it's not the easiest of reads. And I suppose the trick is to have a narrative which is consistently across the piece. So certainly from a member's perspective, it's highlighted without confusion, because gets very difficult to, you can spend hours looking at these trying to work out what it is. So I think that's the challenge, isn't it? The narrative probably just needs to have a simple understand, so we can understand, this is actually okay, slightly overspent or slightly underspent,
It's absolutely fair comment. I think that the highway stuff is particularly challenging because of the number of funding sources that come in to support it, and obviously the net cost to the council is different to what we actually spend maintaining and developing our roads. So it's trying to get all the information in there, but as you say, there maybe needs to be a way of trying to pick out the key points so it's clear to the public what we're doing. Thank you.
Brilliant. Any further comments then, please? Okay, the recommendations are as with the revenue report, which is that we note it and any corrective action. So I think we note the comments about work in progress in terms of how it's presented. Yes, Councillor Davies, sorry. Oh, sorry.
Scrutiny report.
Oh, I do beg your pardon.
It's okay.
Parker scrutiny report. I'm so sorry. Right, which has been circulated as well, but we'll let you go through it.
I'll just add something. I mean, the executive have done a very good job of scrutiny, so there's always places available should anybody want to take them up. So it was a topsy-turvy report in the sense of underspends and overspends, and it's similar in a way to the revenue report. External influences, raw materials, shortage of labour, Suez Canal blockage, Brexit, all combined. So we had highways asset protection with an overspend of 4.145 million and a general overspend of 27 million. Some of the points that were of particular interest is that we noted the substantial amount of underspend in relation to the Spalding Western Relief Road, and I'm sure that other highways will be looking at that to see what's going to happen in relation to redistribution of any other money. We noted that these were committed schemes, but if there was an opportunity to bring forward other schemes to reduce the level of underspend, that I'm sure is being considered, but we flagged that up particularly. I think that the only other point that we'd want to make is in relation to a forecast overspend in relation to highways asset protection. There is a paper going to the council meeting next week for an additional £10 million of funding to be added to the capital programme. That's as much as we wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Yes, apologies again for not bringing you in. Any further comments than what the scrutiny thought was? I think the highways is very complicated. And of course, there's more money coming in, which hasn't been. If the council agrees with it next week, then that will be in there as well. But then it'll further complicate the figures, won't it, in terms of understanding. Sorry. Good. Very good. So come back to the recommendations then. Are you happy to accept those recommendations, which are the same as really as the revenue monitoring report? Is that agreed? Thank you very much. So with that, I believe that concludes the meeting. Thank you for your attendance this morning, and don't get too hot this afternoon. Thank you.